Marina, ich gehe kurz nur auf ihren Lebenslauf ein und übergebe dann, studied philosophy in Oxford, at Wadham College, got her BA at Sarah Lawrence College in New York, her MA 2004 at the Center of Research in Modern European Philosophy, Middlesex University, London, and her PhD 2013 about speculation as a mode of production in art and capital at Queen Mary University, London. Since 2016-17, she has a professorship at the Department of Media, Communication and Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths College, London. She got a large number of grants, residencies and awards everywhere in Europe. Being Arnhem Fellow of this semester now, we are pleased to welcome her in Berlin, which she knows from an earlier residence or professorship at the Hochschule der Künste. With that, I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Müller from the HU Berlin and finally to Marina herself. As usual, we will be able to have a glass of wine together on the third floor after the lecture and discuss itself. Vielen Dank.
Sehr geehrte Stiftungsmitglieder, liebe KollegInnen und Studentinnen, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, Sie erwarten an dieser Stelle die Begrüßung von Professor Dr. Peter Klaus Schuster vom Vorstand der Stiftung Brandenburger Tor. Doch da Herr Schuster leider erkrankt ist, möchte ich Sie als geschäftsführende Direktorin des Instituts für Kunst und Bildgeschichte auch im Namen der Stiftung Brandenburger Tor sowie der weiteren Kooperationspartner der Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz sowie des Deutschen Akademischen Austauschdienstes sehr herzlich zu unserer Arnhem-Lecture des Sommersemesters 2022 willkommen heißen. Ich begrüße ganz besonders Professor Dr. Marina Vishmidt aus London, unsere derzeitige Arnhem-Gastprofessorin und Vortragende am heutigen Abend. Gleich zu Beginn möchte ich der Stiftung Brandenburger Tor, namentlich Franziska Fenner und Kirstin Buchinger, die Sie eben schon gesehen haben, in zweifacher Hinsicht danken. Sie hat beim letzten Mal den technischen Aufwand nicht gescheut, um das denkbar beste Online-Format für die Lecture realisieren zu können und lädt nun erneut in ihre schönen Räumlichkeiten im Max-Liebermann-Haus ein. Wir freuen uns sehr, uns hier wieder begegnen zu können und die seit bald 20 Jahren bestehende Tradition der Arnhem-Lecture an diesem Ort fortführen zu können, der in besonderem Maße zu einer kritischen Reflexion der politischen Dimensionen von Kunst und Kultur auffordert. Ermöglicht wird dies durch die Berliner Sparkasse, die die Stiftung Brandenburger Tor als Kulturstiftung gegründet hat und die Arnhem-Professur maßgeblich und wirklich mit äußerster Großzügigkeit fördert. Dafür möchte ich im Namen des Instituts für Kunst und Bildgeschichte meinen großen Dank aussprechen. Die Arnhem-Lecture bringt Stiftungs- und Institutsmitglieder, darunter nicht zuletzt StudentInnen, Fachkolleginnen sowie Interessierte der breiteren Öffentlichkeit zusammen. Sie lädt zur Diskussion einer ganzen Fülle von Themen ein und vermittelt die Vielfalt von kunst- und bildgeschichtlicher Forschung. Das zeigen allein die Themen der letzten Vorträge, darunter Feminismus und Aktionskunst in der zeitgenössischen Kunst Lateinamerikas, paläolithische Kunst als Gegenstand der Kunstgeschichte, Snapshot Photography sowie Imagination und Metapher in der islamischen Kunst des 12. Jahrhunderts. Am Institut für Kunst- und Bildgeschichte öffnen sich mit der Arnhem-Gastprofessur nicht nur neue Räume des wissenschaftlichen Austauschs und der Vernetzung, vielmehr sind wir auf jedes Semester wirklich aufs Neue begeistert, wenn wir die Seminare unserer Gastprofessur bei der Lehrplanung in unser Programm aufnehmen. Die Studierenden schätzen es ungemein, internationale WissenschaftlerInnen, deren Forschung und Lehrform persönlich kennenzulernen. Das zeigt sich nicht zuletzt an ihrem Besuch der Arnhem Lecture. Die Gastprofessur ist für alle Kooperationspartner eine wirklich sehr große Bereicherung und so freue ich mich sehr auf den heutigen Vortrag von Marina Vishmidt. Sie wird Ihnen nun von meiner Kollegin Eva Eninger vorgestellt.
Hello everybody, so I'm switching to English again. My name is Eva Eninger. I'm Professor for Modern Art History at the Institute of Art and Visual History at Humboldt University, Berlin. It is my great pleasure to introduce Marina Vishmidt, our Arnhem Professor of the year 2022. When she's not here in Berlin with us, sadly, Marina teaches at the Center for Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths College at the University of London and also at the Dutch Art Institute in Arnhem. In her research, she is particularly concerned with the complex relationships between art, value or value creation, and labor. She explores these by looking at artworks and artistic practices that deal, for example, with debt, social reproduction, or artistic entrepreneurship. Speculation has been a key term in Marina's research. She introduces it as a powerful motor of capitalist society, which is specifically visible in the fields of art and finance. The term speculation already figured large in her dissertation, which Marina completed at Queen Mary University in London, and which was published as a monograph with the prestigious Brill Publishing House in 2018 under the title Speculation as a Mode of Production, Forms of Value Subjectivity in Art and Capital. In it, Marina confronts different and contradictory applications of the term in the fields of philosophy, finance, and art. As the title indicates, this differentiated analysis aims to elaborate the role of speculative value ascriptions in the construction of contemporary subjectivity. Marina's parallel analysis of art and finance from the perspective of speculation is challenging for artists, art critics, and art historians alike, as it levels the long-cherished, though arguably always illusionary distinction between artistic work and any other kind of labor. If artistic autonomy is described with speculative terms as the freedom to experiment and create, the artist, as the quintessentially speculative subject, becomes a model figure for the increasingly speculative social and economic realities of today. In order to counter this convergence of artistic thinking and financial operations, a convergence of materials, media, and subjectivities alike, Marina calls for a different sense of speculation, which retains the commitment to experiment and non-utility. This call, this claim is outlined in the book Reproducing Autonomy, Work, Money, Crisis, and Contemporary Art, which she co-wrote together with Kirstin and which is also at the basis of her edited volume Speculation that will appear in the well-known series Documents of Contemporary Art, published by Whitechapel Gallery later this year, I think. For Marina, speculation is then both a field of study and a method. Her own approach can be called speculative in its insistence on situated perspective, as well as its awareness that this situatedness is necessarily contingent and prone to change. There is a sense of responsibility and urgency in Marina's theoretical work, which finds its counterpart in her engagement with social and political activism. For many years, for example, she has worked in a voluntary capacity for Cinevoix, a London-based feminist film and video distributor, and she works with Full Unemployment Cinema, a collective that distributes and presents films on the themes of labor, work refusal, and labor conflict. The Arnhem Professorship was developed as a format that would bring our institute's students and ourselves as well in contact with the critical discourse on contemporary art, as it is shaped by scholars of international renown. Marina's scholarship, but also Marina as a speculative subject, has been the perfect person for this post. As a scholar who turns her thinking upon herself, who in her thoughtful, tentative, and respectful way challenges herself, her students, and her audience to reflect their own positioning within an increasingly speculative world. I would like to thank you, Marina, for your willingness to come to the IKB and to engage with our students and with us in conversations which have been eye-opening for many. I think that the audience tonight, which includes artists, critics, historians, writers, publishers, educators, curators, and activists, many of whom wear more than one of these hats, attests to the fact that your work relates deeply to current artistic and social practices. So we look forward to your talk tonight, which is called From Speculation to Infrastructure, Material and Method in the Politics of Contemporary Art.
Okay. Thank you so much to Eva, Kathrin, Kirstin, and to the Stiftung, to the IKB, to all of you for coming out tonight. And really, yes, very special thanks to the IKB for making my guest professorship so useful and delightful in so many ways, and such great students in your program, in your department. So thank you for my time here. Can everybody hear me? Okay, yeah. As maybe some of you, most of you perhaps in attendance know, today is American Independence Day, US Independence Day, and therefore you see the fireworks that I've added. Okay. So I'll try not to be too fast, because obviously English isn't everybody's first language. Okay. Okay, so from the beginning of my involvement in the field of art and cultural production, whether I was practicing as an academic, a writer, an organizer, an editor, as Eva has mentioned, a number of these capacities, my focus has always been, one way or another, on conditions of possibility, whether those conditions are considered as formal, social, economic, historical, or ontological. The conditions of possibility include the existence and allowances of a demarcated field of practice, and the practices that transpire in that field, which mean the conditions of legibility for practices to both register in that field, though they might originate somewhere else, the field of art, I guess is what I'm thinking of, and for practices originating in that field to work transversally or away from it. So conditions for a field, conditions in a field, but also its composition, the composition of the field, along the vectors of objective and subjective determination by race, class, gender, relation to the law. In other words, since before the beginning, and thus my understanding of, since before the beginning, my experience and thus my understanding of culture has been collective, with the social and personal dimension always embedded in the conceptual. Because my entry to participation was at first in zine culture, which was very much defined by riot girl, punk, and infinite configurations of both projects and structures that were DIY, the artistic and political, material and method were always co-constitutive, and the milieu in its positioning was defined by antagonism, not just politically on specific issues in the right-wing cultural environment, but to the modes of individualized celebrity and mystified creativity, typical of what was then known as mainstream culture. Thus, it was always clear that the ways of organizing artistic production were as critical and political as anything that could be isolated as a work or as a product. And in fact, the distinctions between organization and discrete works and products, and the distinctions between them, which can also be read along the process-product binary, were always contingent and matters of practice and proximity. So this was the 1990s, obviously, the last moment in capitalist modernity, especially in the West, or the imperial, colonial, rich world, when something like a self-sustaining and oppositional underground culture could be said to exist. Although even then, the principles and practicalities of separation from what was then called the mainstream were starting to break down, which perhaps culminates in the contemporary obsolescence of concepts like selling out and the accompanying structure of feeling, no less than the economic agenda of rugged independence that it represented. Of course, many things are obvious now that would have been obvious to many also at the time. That as a dissident cultural milieu in the US, it was a sphere of privilege, or, in a more materialist vocabulary, resource advantage in many ways, predominantly white, English-speaking, and thus exerting a disproportionate cultural influence, even as a reference or a model of underground and independent musical, publishing, and artistic practice. And gender was a much more visible battle than other group identifiers ascribed for oppression and exploitation, at least in that milieu. Of course, there are many other milieus in the underground. You only need to think of the Detroit techno collective Underground Resistance as an example. So it's important to come to this as only one instantiation of an antagonistic or self-sufficient cultural logic, again, both in terms of structure and composition. And it's also not to assert that this is a logic that is extinct or has been made extinct by social media platforms and their powers of capital and attention concentration and fragmentation. Funded, unfunded, less funded, variably funded, a lot of DIY culture continues to exist, especially in poetry and artist publishing, to take just one local example. So the reason I wanted to start with this very contained flashback is perhaps to see if it can furnish a backdrop for explaining the research that I went on to do, mainly in art theory and political theory, which approached the social existence of artistic and visual practice, often moving image in many cases, in my case, not as a thing in the world or even a process, but as a contradiction. The contradiction between its social conditions as an elite pursuit, an asset class, or a laundromat for hegemonic values, and its horizon as an articulation of emancipation, of material, cognitive, and aesthetic, as well as social relations. I thought about this contradiction, but also about the kinds of further contradictions emerging from it. For example, the institutionalization of the latter, art as emancipation, and the institutionalization of that observation as critique, under the material conditions of the former, art as an index of class rule. Given these emphases, in my scholarly work I've been much influenced by Adorno, consistently by notions such as his framing of the proposition of aesthetic autonomy and its relations of dependence on social heteronomy, the double notion of art as absolute commodity and absolute artwork, with the category of the absolute standing in for the imperialism of exchange value in a capitalist society that tells itself fairy tales about artistic transcendence as the use value of art, or in a more contemporary mode, conflating usefulness and criticality. And also, of course, by the relationship between artistic practice and the epistemic refusal that takes the name of non-identity. Which brings me to the approaches mentioned in the synopsis for this lecture as setting the parameters for my work at present, as well as the recent past, speculation and infrastructure. So, social and collective production as the smallest unit of meaningful analysis, with the implication that the trans individual is the smallest meaningful unit of subjectivity, a dialectical and non-exhaustive approach suspicious of theoretical closures or inflations of all kinds, these methodological and political considerations led me to speculation as a way of conceptualizing both artistic practice and the quantified, financialized, and extractive social reality it is working from and with, speculation as the non-identity between speculative thought and the social and political practices it makes possible. Speculation as thinking art from the standpoint of its transformative capacities, as well as speculation as a closed loop of extraction and profit. And then to infrastructure as a way of understanding both what kind of structures repeat, as it were in one definition of infrastructure, structures that repeat, how they repeat across scales, and how the speculative force of aesthetics can clarify, open up, and repurpose these infrastructures in investigative and/or transversal political approaches, as well as disappropriate them or their constituent parts for other ends. So having set the methodological scene for those two approaches, I'd like to move anti-clockwise, at least in terms of Marxist plotting of a movement from the abstract to the concrete, to a more in-depth exploration of what I mean in working with the concepts of speculation and infrastructure as kinds of what I'm going to call experimental totalizations. So initially, I take speculation in its character as a powerful logic of contemporary life whose key instantiations are art and finance. Both are premised on the power of contingency, the fluidity of temporality, and experimentation with the creation, as well as the capitalization, of possible worlds. Artistic autonomy, the self-legislation of the space of art, was once and often still is seen as the freedom to speculate wildly on material and social possibilities. The artist as a speculative subject is also seen as the paragon of creativity, the complete opposite of both a homo economicus, obsessed with balance sheets, value-added and optimizing investment, and the homo laborans, in Hannah Arendt's terms, which we would have to expand from her gender-deterministic framework to include those whose lives are limited by the imperative to work and to reproduce workers, in conditions where both that work and its results is controlled and accumulated by others. However, once social reality becomes speculative and opaque in its own right, risky, algorithmic, overhauled by networked markets and everything, what becomes of the distinction between not just art and finance, but art and life? In working with these premises, I also try to develop art historical methodologies that study specific practices as crystals of both ownership and dispossession, with all the strategic and ontological ambiguities that cluster around each of those poles and between them. Basically, I aim to grasp the stakes of speculation as an issue for current and recent artistic practice, and to develop a transversal concept of speculation in doing so, one which departs from, but is not bound by, the lived ideologies of art and finance sketched out above. So the subjective drive to speculation as the generation of new ideas, per se, can become codified as creativity in the neoliberal labor market. As a consequence, creativity becomes, paradoxically, a characteristic of abstract labor, which was Marx's generic category for the social institution of wage labor in a capitalist society. Abstract because most labor relationships end up being indifferent to the content of the labor and are mainly used for acquiring money to live, or, if you are a capitalist or entrepreneur, to accumulate with or to speculate with. I argue that such a shift heralds the conversion of the fetishized creativity of art into a preeminent instance of speculation as a mode of production, since art becomes no longer just a commodity, in the market or a gratuitous activity, but increasingly a tool of socialization into the speculative mode and an accessory to the revalorization of land and the displacement of populations, as in the well-known link between art venues and gentrification. It thus takes on a new instrumentality relative to the dialectic of autonomy and heteronomy that someone like Adorno assigned to art. At the same time, this is an instrumentality which in its own turn speculates with the autonomy and creative freedom assigned specifically to art in an unfree society in order to ground both its ethical claims and its financial value, depending on the context. As I outline in my book, Speculation as a Mode of Production, the core structural analogy between art and money is that both constitute instances of self-valorizing value, insofar as both are kinds of social mediation that are anchored in a self-referential, recursive, or reflexive circuit of valorization. Critical value in art is generated from transactions within its semantic domain, much as in speculative finance, or fictitious capital in Marxist terms. Money generates more money through transactions internal to financial markets, avoiding the sphere of production as it's usually understood altogether. This homology between art and money that I'm drawing, one which reveals both art and money as marked by the nebulousness and reflexivity of value claims, has been picked up by artists who collide so-called critical value with capital value in works exploring the social and formal correspondences between works of art and money. So Max Haven, for example, would be a colleague who's done excellent work in cataloging and theorizing these kinds of practices in his book from a few years ago, Art After Money, Money After Art. But this discussion of a homology is intended as well to illuminate another pole of art's relation to the real abstraction of the capital relation, one which is constituted by the parallels between artistic subjectivity and the self-motivated and creative labor force increasingly encouraged to see itself as an investment, that is, to model itself on the endless productivity of capital rather than labor, specifically a financialized capital which expands by means of managed risk. This is not just an elite labor force, of course, as the placebos of flexibility and self-management increasingly comes to substitute for any employer responsibility, as evident in the gig economy. So from being at least hypothetically separate from the economy, the artist becomes a creative tasked with diligently optimizing their quantified self, an increasingly abject and coercive situation, and the two senses of speculation, artistic thinking and financial operations, converge, something we have observed not just in the more familiar, critical descriptions of the artist as entrepreneurial subject par excellence, but in more recent developments such as crypto art and NFTs, where the moments of artistic creation and market valorization can no longer be kept apart, and neither can coercion and speculation in a stagnant, crisis-prone economy, characterized by the freedom of finance and the subjugation of labor. So here, a dependency and a resonance emerges between the open-ended processes of speculative thought and the profit-driven, or in cybernetic terms, homeostatic world of financial speculation. At the same time, however, we need to retain another sense of speculation as the commitment to experiment and non-utility for social and political, as well as aesthetic and cognitive reasons. As Hengstlager notes, quote, "From an artistic perspective, it seems essential to start investigating the following methodological question. How could we engage in that assignment of reconsidering and revealing speculation in order to arrive at novel panoramas and not yet known knowledge, apologies, end quote. We can here also think of speculative philosophical propositions such as Hegel's speculative logic, Adorno's concept of non-identity, as already mentioned, or Ferreira da Silva's difference without separability as some conceptual and methodological touchstones. Art historically speaking, when we work with these kinds of paradigms in our research, we can build on the material and social sensitivity and concreteness of art history as a scholarly approach in order to contextualize artworks in their conditions of production and exchange in such a way as to be able to see artistic practices and materials in the social relations and histories that they mediate, and vice versa, and see what ruptures, unknowns, contradictions, and affiliations can be found and developed. With a speculative approach, we do not need to define binaries even in order to overcome them or to integrate a devalued pole into a valued one, binaries such as art and labor, art and life, art and politics, etc., but to constantly redefine our terms with reference to the kinds of questions that the material asks and asks from us, and to see the divisions we encounter as themselves historical, needing to be explained rather than described, and explained often in terms of systemic as well as local, social contradiction and specificity. Speculation, thus, as a method as well as a field of study and praxis, is one that necessitates a situated perspective, but also a readiness for that perspective to shift, both in light of its objects and the shifting problematics and imperatives of knowledge production in its social, historical, and economic relations and antagonisms. In this way, the speculative is brought into contact with the materialist, with the former, the vector of transformation, and the latter of social reality. As tendencies, as constitutive of relations rather than objects, and objects as temporary crystals of relations in a wider, so-called social synthesis, these comprise the touchstones for my project. With all this in mind, there are a few more granular additional points. Speculative practices and fields of inquiry must be situated in their material conditions. Given the speculative infrastructure of contemporary capitalism, it is clear that the speculative capacity of both the science-adjacent research-based and the fictioning or narrative approach to art practice are both determined by speculative capitalism, which includes its market, institutional, and data articulations. A forensic aesthetics is no more or less integrated into the speculative, which is to say, as knowledge production, than a more material, object, or fantasy-based aesthetics. Indeed, it was a number of years ago now that Jacques Rancière noted that dematerialized art and dematerialized capital tend to align. He wrote, quote, "The immateriality of concepts and images, instead of doing away with private appropriation, turned out to be its best refuge, the place where its reality is tantamount to its self-legitimation." Here we see that, as with labor, it is not the content of the art, but how that labor is exchanged, distributed, and represented, that is, how it is inscribed into circuits of valorization, even when, as art, and many types of labor, it is not directly value-producing, traditionally understood in itself. Here we could frame the key critical question in speculative terms, transposing Marx's question about labor to art. It's not that we need to find the value behind the social form of art, but to ask instead, why is it that in our society, value takes the form of art? To move now to a discussion of the role the category of infrastructure has lately taken in my work, I want to start with a citation from Willem Flusser, who talks about envisioning, by which he means, quote, trying to turn an automatic apparatus against its own condition of being automatic. In the context of my work, without a doubt, this implicates the automaticity of value valorizing itself, what Marx calls the automatic subject. Over the past few years, over the particular crises which have dominated our lives and awareness, episodes of climate collapse by fire and water, the pandemic, and the horrific military campaigns attacking the people of Syria, Palestine, Yemen, or Ukraine, we've also heard a lot about what is often called critical infrastructure, that is, the power grid, server architecture, internet, water supplies, all the semi-automated networks key to our survival, that a depletion of supplies, a system fault, or a malicious hacking operation can render dysfunctional, with consequences that are potentially destructive as well as unpredictable, depending on how long such systems remain offline. These are also scenarios that have, of course, taken place wherever there has been a climate crisis-induced natural disaster, such as flooding and fire, or as a consequence of war. Thus, the notion of critical infrastructure and the resources and workers that keep it operating or are vulnerable to attack came to mind in this project, which is an attempt to see how the category of critique needs to be revised when it is posited as operating on an infrastructural and not simply discursive level, as well as to see how the operation of critique can generate new relations between those discursive and infrastructural levels. But also whether indeed the discursive and philosophical notion of critique, which has been justifiably queried from so many perspectives over the recent period, is or isn't a critical infrastructure for how organizational and political change happens in the space of art and how broader changes can resonate there. So infrastructural critique needs to reckon with what it means that infrastructure is that which persists and which makes possible, insofar as it also makes impossible, requiring us to align a thinking of infrastructure with Foucault's discussion of regimes of governmentality whose purpose is to make live and let die. Infrastructure, then, is always specific. It is sustained and maintained to achieve certain biopolitical outcomes, to enable certain strategies of accumulation that are founded on destroyed infrastructure for some, insofar as it supports accumulation for others. That is, the extraction and waste disposal of labors, lives, and natures. A recent intervention in an online series on infrastructure and coloniality notes that, quote, race is an infrastructure, which mediates access to resources, whose withholding is key to the population management key for efficient extraction. A differentiated management of infrastructural coercion and infrastructural neglect, as they refer to it. Death by infrastructure, as in large areas inhabited by communities subject to environmental racism, unfolds in the shadows of death by police violence, death by poverty, and deaths of despair. It could arguably even be said to serve as a precondition for all of these. And yet, if infrastructure should be identified and historicized as the material basis for violent processes of racialization, for materialist analysis, it is crucial as well to look at the other side of this argument. Who benefits? Notably, extractive corporations and the perma-colonial states they are imbricated with, now reproduced at a global scale. For Zandi Sherman, infrastructural and ontological lenses are not opposed. She writes, infrastructure is ontological, end quote, because it is the material basis for the reproduction of race. The social being of race is both produced by the operations of extractive infrastructure, and race is an infrastructure in its own right, legitimating the normalized violence physical infrastructure both captures and extends. If we stick to the idea that race is an infrastructure, what else does it make possible as the converse of its pedagogy of abjection and disavowal? As thinkers such as Sylvia Wynter, David Lloyd, and Denise Ferreira da Silva have been elaborating, what it makes possible is the human. The human is the rational subject who creates and maintains infrastructures of progress and abundance where once there was only primitive subsistence and warfare. The human is the bringer of infrastructure to a chaotic nature, where infrastructure and property claims come into light in the same moment. As English language predicates such as humane, and concepts such as humanity and humanism demonstrate, the human marks the point of inextricability, of domination and care, which an infrastructure can be said to materialize. Can we jettison this figure of normativity while holding on to a notion of ethics, such as the poethics of existence without the separability that makes domination acceptable? Rather than try to answer that knotty question immediately, I want now to keep moving through some more recent approaches to the infrastructural. With the foregoing consideration of the relation between infrastructure and critical praxis, what has been elided so far are current debates around blockage, occupation, and sabotage in their efficiency for disrupting a capitalism wholly dependent on the functionality of supply chains, on just-in-time circulation of objects, services, and data, along the waterways, pipelines, fiber optic cables, and transport systems. This kind of practical critique of infrastructure has been extensively theorized in recent discussions, whether it's in terms of struggles that include dimensions of decolonial and indigenous sovereignty, such as the multiple pipeline blocking movements in North America since 2018's No Dakota Access Pipeline. There's one recent one. Or the pushback, of course, or the blockage of West Coast ports in the United States. Aside from the agency of organized pushback, of course, there are the ongoing significant logistical issues caused by the fallout of the pandemic, such as labor shortages, high fuel prices, and backups in shipping lanes. More generally, theorists such as Joshua Clover famously contended in the mid-2010s that sabotage has gained an epochal salience in an era when capitalism's secular tendency to flee from production into circulation, by circulation meaning sectors such as transport and services, as well as financialization, has made it not just more vulnerable to forms of logistical sabotage, but that sabotage, blockage, and riot were the modes of antagonism more relevant to this composition of capital than more traditional forms of resistance, such as strikes, in his argument. And so, to recap then, the conditions of possibility in art open up into the analysis of different infrastructural approaches to both culture and politics, and the relation between these approaches, some directly material, others more conceptual or metaphorical, remains speculative, that is, defined through their identity in difference. It may now be the time to turn to some specific cases of art production, as well as art institutions, that can be thought under the rubric of infrastructure and the speculative. It is clear that infrastructural critique has made inroads there, though it remains a minoritarian tendency when measured against the pervasiveness of representational and narrative strategies. We can discuss infrastructural critique with reference to movements around labor organizing in arts institutions, such as the wave of unionizing of art workers since the beginning of the pandemic, as well as social movements focusing on arts institutions which center anti-colonial solidarity at arts institutions, movements such as Decolonize This Place or Strike MoMA in New York City, to take two very reported instances. These were instances that tried to inhabit the gap between art institutions' gestural benevolence and material violence in order to insert radical disruption in the form of solidarity with struggles elsewhere, predominantly around police violence, racialized gentrification, or the colonial war against Palestinians. Yet infrastructural critique can also characterize specific practices of artists and institutions as a move that similarly takes their practice beyond the comfort zone of reflexivity and thus veers away from the lane allocated to artists by institutional critique, by the legacy of institutional critique. So there's work by Cameron Rowland. Cameron Rowland's intensively researched and conceptually adroit projects zero in on the apparatus of racialized capitalism as a spectrum of real abstractions. These real abstractions, or abstractions with deadly effects, include race, property, and value, as they work through prisons, police, cultural, and state authorities, now and in the lingering past. These abstractions, in turn, provide both formal and practical tools for an aesthetics that is not so much forensic as it is prismatic. On the point of involving the arts institution in a financial market venture, which is one of the things that's going on here, and that has happened in other projects of his, there's an echo of early institution critical projects such as Robert Morris's Money from 1969. The difference is in the politics and the purpose. It's not about disclosing something already evident about the art institution's intimacy with speculative capital. Such an intimacy is only one symptom among many of the ties between culture and private property, with dispossession at the basis of both. With Roland's work, there's often a pedagogical performativity involved, which both presents a detailed historical array of text and a selective summoning of artifacts at the same time, as a real-time deployment of the same legal machinery which upholds the sanctity of property, present and past. A partial list would be 2020's encumbrance that you see here at London's ICA, which involved the mortgaging of the royal building's mahogany fittings obtained in colonial trade, or 2017's Public Money, which is a project that we're republishing in the Speculation Reader, which required the Whitney to invest in anti-recidivism social impact bonds issued by a California municipality. 2016's Disgorgement, which is the establishment of an insurance trust held in the name of Artist Space, although since purchased by MoMA, which bought shares in the slave insurance policy still held by a major global insurer, and which will pay out in the event of federal financial reparations being passed, financial reparations for chattel slavery being passed by the US government, and 910-20000 from 2016, which put on display the mobile infrastructure of the public realm in the state of New York, school and office furniture made by prison labor, and that number designated the customer number of Artist Space as a customer of the furniture thus produced by the state agency in New York. Many of these objects cannot be sold to any collection but only rented at cost price. That is, the price paid at a police auction or to a prison-made furniture manufacturer for a period of 5 years pending renewal or return to the artist. In much of Roland's work, a piece of infrastructure relates to a history of property and dehumanization through the way it functions rather than what it uses artistic means to depict. This, in conjunction with the frequent implication of the institution as a collaborator, both with Roland and with the system that he's highlighting, is what casts his practice as what I would call one of infrastructural critique. In an essay by the artist and distributed cognition cooperative member Anna Engelhardt, contextualizing her project that you see there, the Crimean Bridge, with the tagline of adversarial infrastructure, she contends, in line with Timothy Mitchell's argument, that the politics of infrastructure are often cloaked by the image of utility, which in the case of a bridge assumes the even more benign trappings of connection, as opposed to the conflict signaled by a wall, for example. The bridge constructed by Russia over the Kerch Strait between Russia and the Crimean Peninsula is analyzed by Engelhardt as a de facto wall or border, facilitating Russian economic colonialism in Ukraine before, during, and after the 2014 annexation. This is a model of infrastructure as war by other means, as she calls it, that she observes in the depiction of social media platforms such as Facebook as global engines of connection, even as they facilitate multi-scalar conflict. And this is a trope familiar from 18th century ideologists of capitalism who juxtaposed connection to war, civilized commerce to war, thus blithely averting their gaze from the inseparability between commerce and war established by the several centuries of settler colonialism and trade in humans that had already elapsed by the time they were writing. So working with this example of logistics which communicates flow even while enforcing restriction, promoting repression in the guise of mobility, Engelhardt disassembles the bridge in her essay, while a film of the same name, The Crimean Bridge, uses volumetrics, crystallography, clips of Russia Today reports, and other technical media to reassemble the bridge in all its dimensions as a species of what she calls hybrid warfare, with ecological no less than geopolitical impacts that unfold over several temporalities. Here, the infrastructural critique does not show the recursive volatility that comes with implicating its own material sites of enunciation, the art space, the art institution, as part of the object, as with Roland's work. However, the site of enunciation may be understood differently in work like this. It's not the art institution that is key, but digital platforms. It is the media propaganda complex that combines advanced technology and crude manipulation, the logistics of war and the logistics of trade, exemplified in this Crimean case. Infrastructure here is the real abstraction of communication, which is at the core of violence, with property just one of its symptoms. Finally, and in a change of key, it may be helpful to look at a few instances of organizational rather than artistic practice, with learning from artistic practice as its strategy. Now, the image I'm about to show here represents this tendency, but it's not exactly what I'm going to speak about first. So the first practice that I'll refer to, which is also was organized by a curator who will give a guest lecture in the BA seminar I'm teaching in the IKB, Eric Gollostone. The project was called Reconsidering Institutional Conduct. Almost everything still remains to be done, at the Künstlerhaus Stuttgart last year. So this project's relation to infrastructural critique could be detected precisely in the inward and outward-facing task that it set for itself, to revisit its protocols of institutional governance as a site of radical remaking in a wider social landscape that desperately required transformation, and which could start with where it was as a site of implementation of that change, part of which meant rethinking the boundaries of the institutions inside and outside. While the long-term implications of what was just a 2-day process, as far as I know, have not yet come into focus, it joins a number of drafting projects situated in arts institutions over the past decade, some of which have participated in or facilitated an institutional shift already underway, as this drafting of a convention on the use of space, organized by Adelita Husni Bey with local housing groups, in Utrecht in 2018, or the initiation of a climate justice code for arts organizations in 2019, both at Casco, now called the Casco Art Institute, working for the Commons in Utrecht. So these kinds of projects, these kinds of initiatives, tendencies suggest that at least for a fraction of smaller Western arts organizations, publicly funded arts organizations, a self-perception of themselves as infrastructure, as part of the functional social landscape, is starting to displace the traditional concept of the institution as a detached container that displays aspects of that landscape, including critique. So the repercussions of this type of shift may be variable and intermittent, and certainly local, with the local here addressing a context of reference which can be geographic, but also discursive. No doubt there are risks of insularity if the drive for reflexivity leads to an overemphasis on the agency of the institution rather than its conditions of possibility. While this is connected to, if not determined by, broader levels of social struggle, it is also influenced by the vision of political agency which an arts institution chooses to embody and/or amplify in its own particular circumstances. So to conclude, all these questions point to the need to understand the concept of critique at issue in infrastructural critique. I mean, there's probably other questions and needs in this huge outline. The shift argued for, the shift to infrastructural critique, cannot leave critique in its own right untouched, with its acknowledged genealogy and the unconditional autonomy of the isolated and European-identified Enlightenment subject that informs most debates around the notion of critique in the sphere of critical theory these days. This ensures that the history, no less than the potential of critique as a material practice of antagonism, gets sidelined. Material practice whose subject, if there is one, is dispersive and collective. Critique is, at its philosophical origins, shall we say, with Kant, an analysis of conditions of possibility, but that the analysis of conditions of possibility itself has conditions of possibility that are material and not epistemological, that is infrastructural, is perhaps the point. And the resources necessary to flesh out this other practice of critique, in an apparent paradox, owe substantially, actually, to contemporary debates around what gets called identity politics, inasmuch as those debates can also intensify the salience of a relational non-identity and negativity to any notion of critique that makes claims on the infrastructure that provides it with its conditions, that is to say, with the material possibilities of critique, as well as the object of critique. When Hannah Black writes about, quote, the self as historical and social material, end quote, in the space of art, a self that entails a non-identity with the real, what she calls the real structures of quote unquote identity, she is describing identity as a structure imposed on the non-white, non-male cultural worker, whether it's by liberal arts institutions looking to burnish their inclusion agendas or identity critics who consistently frame a reified notion of identity as the distraction from class on the left. In that crude concept of identity, which is identitarian at the same time as it identifies with criticality, and where critique is only possible in the embrace of the unspoken whiteness of universality, there's a contradiction between identity and non-identity that recalls Adorno's appropriation of non-identity, but also visibly Hegel's own argument in The Science of Logic when he notes, quote, essence is mere identity and reflection in itself, only as it is self-relating negativity, and in that way self-repulsion. It contains, therefore, essentially the characteristic of difference, end quote. Conversely, an infrastructural critique is defined by the tension between the clarifying negativity of knowing who its opponents are, as well as the differences that traverse its own speaking position. Critique is then the practice of non-identity as self-relating negativity. It is the irreconcilability without end of social antagonism, which is invariably reflected in the institution of art and its real-world spaces, even as they programmatically commit to inclusion to undercut their own status, at least on some level, as infrastructures of domination. This antagonism is turned into aporia, insoluble and perhaps not even very interesting, if confined within the framework of the institution, which is to say at the level of programming. But as soon as it gains a transversal dimension by looking to the infrastructure and sees itself too as infrastructure, there is a gain, one could even call it a gain of function, in the capacity of critique to not only query its own conditions of existence, but to see how the resources of critique itself can provide infrastructure for other fights, which pull the institution, exhibiting, but also academic, just to take two examples relevant here, into their vortex. So this is one way, perhaps, of thinking speculation and infrastructure alongside one another. So what I'm proposing is that the means of abstraction, or speculation, also needs to be thought from the bottom up and inside out, in conjunction with social struggle. And the question of abstraction is not just about control, but can also give us a relational view on artistic and economic practice as they constitute social forms, the smallest meaningful units of a politically entangled art historical, art theoretical method. That's it.
Thank you so much. I don't have a microphone, but I think it should be fine like this, no? I'll speak up.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your lecture.
Should I stay here?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, I'll start the discussion and then open up for questions right away.
Great.
So, thank you. And I think for me, your kind of parallel discussion of these two terms illuminated something that you have pinpointed out throughout your discussion of the term speculation already, which is this kind of necessity to focus on material conditions, on material bases, the concreteness, in a sense, of the speculative field. Thank you. I hope I don't have to repeat myself now. So I think this became quite graspable for me through your parallelization of these two terms in your talk. And I think at one point you said infrastructure is, in a sense, the materialization of domination or of care. It can go both ways, but it's it's a field where this materialized, where speculation can become materialized. And I was wondering also what you're doing with the term infrastructure is, in a sense, what you're doing with the term speculation as well. You turn it from a field into a method, in a sense. And this happens when you switch these terms around from critical infrastructure to infrastructural critique. And coming from there, you describe this category of infrastructural critique as kind of an opportunity to operate not just on a discursive level, but on this infrastructural level. And I was wondering if I understand this correctly, or maybe if you could elaborate that, what this means specifically. So from my understanding, what becomes important is then this material basis, this the attentiveness to infrastructure as a material basis of processes of the hegemonic status quo, but at the same time as kind of an opportunity. And I was wondering if I understood this correctly, but also what that might entail. So what is it about infrastructure that opens up critique in that sense? Is it this idea of the loop, or of the scale? Yeah, so.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's probably lots of potential ways of thinking about, or potential examples. I guess what I was thinking with infrastructural critique is just a way to make connections. So, for example, the kinds of sort of transversal protest movements that took, for example, the museum as their center, but just one node in a system, which allows, in a way, it's both a node and it's a kind of lens that exposes or clarifies certain relationships. So I think this idea of turning an institution into an infrastructure allows it to become useful in the movement, or allows it to be disaggregated into the resources it can provide for different projects of organizing, perhaps.
And it becomes decentralized, in a sense, in that logic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, are there any questions from the audience at this point? Yes, in the very back.
Sorry, my question. Thank you for my I would like to ask you to elaborate or to help me understand the difference in terms of politics between this social practice of practical infrastructural critique and infrastructural critique in the field of art.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say infrastructural critique within the field of art is maybe kind of sketching out what... Is this still working? I think it is, okay. Can sort of in a way be modeling or sketching out what form it could. So I guess thinking about infrastructure in a way, it kind of comes back to an institution, because it's an institution which can be a basis or a base for other kinds of research and other kinds of activity, at the same time as being one of the objects of that activity, potentially. So the art practices and artworks that I was looking at are, in a way, kind of sketching out an infrastructural relation in the information or in the kind of products that they create as artworks, and the infrastructural relation being between different levels of social reality, say the art institution, histories of property, sort of prison, and non-profits, for example, in the US case with the artist space instance. So I guess there's a kind of diagramming that's going on in those art projects. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily want to claim that processes of activism outside of those institutions should be reformulated as infrastructural critique. It's more a way of kind of thinking, where do we go beyond institutional critique within those institutions that decenter the institution, but still use its resources and maybe disaggregate the resources in different ways. So yeah, it's maybe not so much about rethinking political practice, but more rethinking artistic practice.
Thank you very much for this really incredible talk. My question is twofold, so to say. First, I was thinking what your category, especially of infrastructure, would look like if we undergo a sort of Bloombergian metaphorological analysis of it. So to unpack exactly, I mean, this, you mentioned this genealogy of the Enlightenment, the subject also that is embedded in the very category of infrastructure. And so I was wondering, we can imagine a sort of also art as part of the infrastructure against the infrastructure. But my question is does art exist also outside the infrastructure? This is the first part of my question. And somehow you also mentioned in different moments practices like sabotage. I was thinking about hijacking. And so one of the, let's say, arrival point of this approach, is it a dismantling of the infrastructure itself, so to say? And in that case, what then we would have? I think that part of the answers were also already suggested by the discussion, but do you see something like a more rhizomatic, for example, structure? But again, I use structure, probably not structuralistic way, but again, structure is true that a term that itself, and this was what I meant in my first part of the question, is really, I mean, powerful in showing and hiding things. So I hope that you can make something of these remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's really generative. I guess actually maybe to slightly turn around my response to the previous question, obviously I was showing this image as a kind of representation of infrastructural critique before I started talking about the artworks and the art institutions. And in a sense, you could say it's a kind of practical critique. It's organizing against certain kinds of infrastructures to be built, which is more kind of in line with the conventional notion of infrastructure as kind of built environment, energy infrastructure, and so forth. And of course, there was this other notion operating in the text, which I think is actually being developed a lot at the moment from different perspectives, of infrastructure as also a kind of epistemological approach, I guess you could say. So both of those were sort of operating at the same time, maybe not always very distinctly in what I said. And I guess this idea of like, if there's a sabotage or a dismantling, what is left, you could say, well, there's maybe counter infrastructures that develop in the process of resistance, in the process of antagonism. Like, for example, I mean, there could be some very banal examples to give here, but say in like occupations, what kinds of social reproduction structures develop when there's an occupation, say a long-term occupation, whether it's in a square or in a building. So I guess these kinds of practical critiques, which inevitably, if they're not just kind of one-day protests, engage with infrastructures, whether it's from the standpoint of blockage or from the standpoint of developing counter-infrastructures like undergrounds of various kinds, as I was saying at the beginning, where it's like where I kind of came into the field of culture was through these kind of counter-infrastructures and counter-networks that didn't necessarily see themselves as opposed, but just as kind of developing another kind of reality or other forms of exchange and other forms of culture. So I guess to all that is kind of, I guess I would maybe want to point to that productive or certainly kind of aesthetic moment in negativity or in sabotage, hijacking, undermining existing infrastructures. But this is, it's obviously a big conversation, and it means something different when you're talking about pipeline blockages, or if you're kind of talking about DIY culture. But there's, what maybe bridges them is the proposition that resistance creates its own infrastructures potentially, or actually. But I think I maybe was just touching on really one small part of your question, the part that maybe I could instantly process a bit better. But there's certainly a lot more to what you were asking.
Thank you. Just to come back to the question in the back, I wanted to draw from this, from your response in saying that artistic practice might kind of serve as a model or as something from which one can extrapolate or explain infrastructural critique, maybe. And it reminded me of a discussion we had with the artist Jonas Stahl in our seminar just a few weeks ago, where he was calling also for something that he called organizational art, and it sounded quite similar to what you touched upon at the end of your talk. For him, as far as I kind of recall and as far as I understood him, he meant that these activist practices that he kind of works through in his artistic work, to make them more sustainable, in a way to build infrastructures that allow these practices to keep existing and keep doing their job in an artistic, but also kind of beyond the artistic realm, through finding finance and finding structures, so building an infrastructure. And I was wondering what did you mean exactly with this kind of call on, I think you called it organizatorial art practice, right? And is this in some way related to this call that we learned from Jonas Stahl? I'm not sure if, that makes sense, but I just felt that it was interesting that there were these terms that were so closely connected, and they both related to an infrastructural model, even though it was supposed to be an alternative one.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting resonance. I'm not sure I said organizational art, but now I can't remember what it is that I did say.
I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood. Yeah.
I mean, I said lots of things, so that's fair enough. But yeah, I mean, I guess on the point of kind of, in a way, taking the epistemic as well as material sort of position or latitudes or kind of potentials, capacities that being located in the field of culture or the field of academia, as well as kind of, actual economic resources, and maybe using them to, appropriating them differently, redistributing them differently, using them to kind of set up channels and tunnels between different spheres of activity or spheres of organization. I guess I would say that is a kind of, sort of using the institution you're starting from as a platform to move elsewhere or to bring other things into a space where they benefit from the resources that can be mobilized, I guess. I mean, I think somebody like Sven Ludekin, for example, has thought about these kinds of practices, Jonas Stahl's in particular, in much more detail than I have. I guess maybe I might have some questions around that particular practice as a kind of, maybe in the sense that it, even so far as it thinks about distributing resources differently, it's also in a sense kind of accumulating kind
That
of
was what
activist-
struck us. That's why
activist practices, and he's
mhm.
obviously not the only artist who does that. There's many examples. So I guess, yeah, it's obviously a very ambivalent terrain, I think, where the question becomes about kind of, in a way, bolstering the artist's power in the way that they can be a sort of mediator of these resources. Then maybe there's a little bit of a question there, but there's also a certain way that practices become visible that can create this centrality for the artist within the institutions, that the way they're set up. So yeah, it's very ambiguous. But
Thank you. Yeah. I think, yes. Yeah.
Thank you for laying that out so generously. I have a question also relating to the last part of your talk, because as you were just saying, again, as an answer to an earlier question, you're using infrastructure in a sense to derail institutional critique in art, because that sort of repeats autonomy as isolation, and so with infrastructure, like you enforce like a spreading of the question of not only of responsibilities, but also of materialities. And I was wondering, because in the end of your talk, you were speaking about the relation of identity, criticality, and negativity, if in a sense what you were mapping out in relation to Hannah Black's writing, like this question of identity politics, what you suggest with that in a way is, like going beyond the institutional critique of the subject. Because like if you shift like the infrastructural terms you were talking about earlier, also towards this relationship of like the Hegelian subject, negativity and identity, then infrastructure becomes something which unsettles the identity of the autonomy of the modern subject. Does that make any sense? Like I was wondering if this is what you're doing, or
it's what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think why I brought in that reference to the identity artist and the identity critic text is perhaps the way identity becomes a kind of institutional mechanism, right? And kind of thinking infrastructurally, maybe as an example of kind of thinking infrastructurally instead, would be like, well, what is this category of identity making possible, and for whom, and what is it making impossible? And if you kind of think of non-identity not just as a kind of pathos of difference or alienation, but something which kind of brings in struggle and contradiction into the space of the speaking position, then non-identity does bring the infrastructure in, I guess, maybe. But I feel like that is very, very, very dense. That's kind of, or condensed. But I think that's maybe kind of what I was trying to do there, to kind of, the way she kind of politicizes non-identity, I thought was very useful as a kind of bringing some things together, and in a sense infrastructure as a kind of more sprawling or more broader understanding of institution maybe shouldn't just be about scale, but the way it kind of articulates things, that there's a certain politics to how it articulates things together. So, yeah. Sorry, that's just the beginning of a response.
Thank you very much, Marina. I was also very intrigued by this idea of...
Excuse me, sorry. Jakob, could you... Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much, Marina, for this talk. It was really super inspiring and stimulating presentation. I was particularly intrigued also by this idea of infrastructural critique as a kind of update, as it were, of institutional critique, and the example of Cameron Rowland that you discussed. And I was curious because it seemed the Cameron Rowland examples were still nevertheless relying very much on a on a kind of traditional institutional infrastructure for art. And in the past decade, and maybe even much accelerated through COVID, the infrastructure for art itself has also been significantly transformed. I mean, you pointed to NFTs as really like an entire, in a way, new infrastructure for the distribution of art, but one could also just think of the importance of social media with really maybe becoming the primary channel through which works are encountered, but also becoming important for the discourse and potentially even displacing to a certain extent art criticism in journals, etc. And so I was wondering how a transformation of the infrastructure for art factors into the notion of infrastructural critique.
Mm-hmm. No, exactly. So that's kind of what I was trying to do by mapping from, in a way, this kind of very kind of art space immanent practice that Roland has to a much more social media immanent practice of the Anne Engelhardt and distributed cognition cooperative with the Crimean Bridge piece, which is not at all really relying on art institutions specifically, but more kind of various mechanisms of production, resource, and publicity. And then kind of thinking about institutional projects like at Casco or at Künstlerhaus Stuttgart that try and sort of disperse themselves into a kind of these ideas around commons, for example, in the case of Casco, as a kind of productive infrastructure in the community, which is not sort of confined to being a space of art mediation. But these, are very also quite sort of limited, in a sense, very specific projects. And I think maybe, thinking about social media or sort of like the platform NFTs more broadly, which I'm going to be doing in a few weeks in another conference, it's kind of taking on the topic more expansively, more frontally. But I think I just wanted to map in a way between Roland, Engelhardt, and things like Casco, Stuttgart as three examples of art that takes the institution as its point of departure to map the infrastructural dependencies. Art that doesn't really rely on the art institution, works more in social media and other spaces like YouTube, and art and the art institution as kind of dispersing itself in a kind of infrastructural critical project. But those are very kind of initial mappings, each of which would, of course, require its very own paper. So that's what your question made me think of. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have one more question from the audience, and then I have another one. And then we will wrap up for drinks.
Thank you very much for your thought-provoking lecture. I would like to come back to the question of identity or questioning of identity in terms of de-essentializing identity. And I'm very curious about your linkage of speculation to non-identity. Maybe you could elaborate a bit on this linkage and where you would you see exactly the ruptures and potential for new political alliances, both epistemologically and also in terms of political activism. That would be very interesting. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
That's a great question, one I kind of think about a lot. I guess with the speculative, the way I was trying to develop it, it's kind of approaching any position through its conditions of possibility and impossibility, so kind of approaching any political position as well as artistic or kind of institutional position. And in that sense, it maps onto non-identity in the way that the kind of the reality and the concept do not the concept does not subsume the object, as in the kind of Adornian discussion. So with taking kind of moving non-identity, as I was kind of referring to Hannah Black's essay, into this kind of contesting the role of identity in the representational politics of the art institution. There's also, of course, a way to contest it in the representational politics more generally, which I think is maybe moving closer to what you're raising. And I guess, I mean, probably one very kind of obvious and banal way to approach that would be, well, you know, identity and difference, solidarity, etc. But of course, that's a beginning, if it's even as much as a beginning. So I guess what I was interested in my project is how going through art allows you to think more speculatively about politics. So just as a kind of starting point or departure point of a method. And that is through kind of thinking through materiality, contingency, irreconcilability, not opacity, as conditions for political action and political organizing. That there kind of is no way to translate identity into strategy. Maybe you could say it that way. But these, yeah, I feel like my answer is like extremely methodological and epistemic, and not actually very very concrete. But maybe, yeah, that's kind of bouncing back to where I'm coming from to this question, but it's very much in process for me. Thank you.
Thank you. You might have already answered my last question. When you started your talk and you talked a little bit about your own kind of socialization as a scholar and organizer in the 1990s, you mentioned that, or said that there, was kind of this was the last instance, in a sense, of an oppositional culture, like an underground culture, which had an antagonistic position against mainstream culture, though that kind of antagonism was barely in existence, but it was still kind of palpable and there. And this, of course, implies that that's not the case anymore today. And I have students in different seminars that are growing kind of increasingly impatient with this kind of narrative of loss, rightly so, I think. And they contest it, of course, because they're left out of this moment of antagonism. And this is why I think you might have already answered my question, but I was wondering if this focus on methodology, this kind of pinpointing of a methodological rearrangement through speculation and infrastructural critique would allow at least a kind of temporary antagonistic self-positioning, or how would you answer my students?
I think all our students, really. Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots and lots of narratives, some of which are more or less conservative, but all of which have some kind of melancholic dimension, which talk about which, some of them try and be more structural, others are just more kind of like descriptive, that say, well, there is no such thing as an oppositional culture anymore because on the internet everything is available at the same time. So that's like a very technological deterministic approach, and also saying, well, there's also no kind of other economies which can serve as everything needs to be sponsored by a corporation now in order even to take a position of antagonism at the level of its discourse. And I guess what I would say, maybe with this emphasis on methodology that you're pointing to, is that I think I maybe mentioned a little bit as well, that obviously there's a lot of kind of independent DIY culture that continues to exist more or less kind of with explicit political interest or positioning. And so this kind of narrative of loss is obviously, very much a kind of matter of perspective, and it's also a kind of way of, I guess, judging or evaluating what is from a position that is not the position of involvement. And I guess any such like large-scale cultural assessments, which I think was kind of running through my text, need to be made, if they're being made, from a position of involvement. So like the way antagonism looks, the way independence looks might have changed, but it's not to say like they're like these objects that have become unavailable to us or have become possible, because these are relational ideas, relational categories. So yeah, I mean, that sounds a bit wishy-washy, but I think that's what I was trying to go for.
No, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you again so much for your lecture, Marina. We have learned tons again, and it was also a great pleasure to have this lively discussion. Thank you, everybody, for your questions, and again also for your enlightening answers to them. I would also like to thank again Frau Buchinger. For your kind introduction and for having us here at this place. And I'd like to invite all of you for drinks on the roof terrace. I was instructed to say this at the end of this lecture, so please feel invited and to continue the conversation with us. And thank you for coming, and see you soon again.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.